If one man's pain could create a weapon that rewrote the fate of nations, would you believe it? Picture a mechanic's hands in early March of 1943 at Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. Oil stains cover his palms, sparks fly from welding tools, and before him stands a bomber that should not exist. 850 caliber machine guns jutted out from a nose that once carried only glass and a bombardier's seat. This was not in the manuals, not authorized, not approved. It was an outlaw's creation, born of desperation, and it would soon tear open the Pacific theater in ways no one imagined. The man behind it was no engineer from West Point. He was a father whose wife and children languished in a prison camp. His answer was not silence. His answer was fire. And in the coming months, thousands of Japanese sailors would pay the price. Stay with us, because this is not just another story. Subscribe and uncover the truths your textbooks left behind. That outlaw was Paul Pappy Gunn. To the world he became the maverick who transformed the B-25 Mitchell from a medium bomber into a ship killer. But to him, it was personal, a war waged to end another, a desperate gamble to shorten the nightmare. The Pacific in 1942 was not a theater of victory. It was a theater of desperation. Japan had advanced with shocking speed, seizing territory after territory, and by the time Allied forces regrouped in Australia, the enemy controlled vital supply routes. The jungles of New Guinea became killing grounds, where American and Australian soldiers fought against endless waves of Japanese reinforcements. For the men on the ground, the problem was simple. Every time they drove the enemy back, fresh troops and supplies arrived by sea. Convoys of transports escorted by destroyers steamed south from Rabaul, and the Allies could not stop them. Conventional bombing tactics had failed. The mighty flying fortress, the B-17, dropped its loads from high altitude, but Japanese ships had minutes to maneuver. Accuracy was dismal. Less than one bomb in 100 found its mark. Every missed strike meant more enemy troops landing, more Allied casualties in the jungles, more ground surrendered. Morale sank as the enemy's lifeline by sea seemed untouchable. Against this backdrop stood Paul Gunn, a man out of place and yet perfectly suited to the crisis. Known later as Pappy, he was in his early 40s when war came to the Philippines. He had once worn a Navy uniform, serving as a chief petty officer and learning to fly in the 1920s. He spent 2 decades with aircraft, not from theory in classrooms, but through grease, engines, and propellers. He managed Philippine Airlines before the Japanese attack, living with his wife Polly and their 4 children in Manila. Life was comfortable. Then came December 8, 1941, Manila time. Japanese bombers turned Nichols Field into a blazing ruin. In hours, the Guinea Air Force in the Philippines was crippled. Gunn pressed into service, was commissioned as a captain, and ordered to fly whatever remained. The chaos of those days was unforgettable. Gunn flew reconnaissance and supply missions under fire. He dodged Zero fighters, crash-landed in the jungle, walked out alive, and climbed back into another cockpit. He earned a Distinguished Flying Cross for a daring run into Bataan, delivering medical supplies in an unarmed transport through enemy airspace. But his greatest battle was not in the skies. It was at home. Polly and the children could not escape as the Japanese advanced. By January 1942, they were captured and interned in Santo Tomas, a converted university in Manila. Gunn was in Australia by then, obeying orders to evacuate. He had followed the rulebook, and the rulebook had cost him his family. Something hardened inside him. To fight as an officer of the United States Army Air Forces was one thing. To fight as a father bent on revenge was another. Each mission became personal. He could not break the gates of Santo Tomas, but he could strike the empire that put them there. Every Japanese ship sunk brought him closer, in his mind, to saving Polly and the children. He was no longer simply Captain Gunn. He was a man at war with an enemy, and with the regulations that bound him. General George Kenney arrived in Australia in mid-1942 to take command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. He inherited a mess, poor morale, outdated aircraft, ineffective bombing doctrine. MacArthur distrusted the air arm completely. Kenney, however, was unconventional. He believed air power could turn the tide, but only if adapted to the realities of this theater. He recalled experiments in the 1920s with low-level bombing, skip bombing, where bombs were dropped just above the water to bounce into ships' hulls. The idea was sound. The execution was lacking. Flying into mast-height altitudes meant running a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. Unless something suppressed those guns, it was suicide. This is where Gunn came in. Already experimenting on his own, he stripped transparent noses off A-20 Havoc light bombers and replaced them with banks of 50 caliber Browning machine guns. What should have been the place for a bombardier became a solid nose of fire. These makeshift conversions stunned Kenney. Where others saw violations of regulations, Kenney saw solutions. Instead of court-martialing Gunn, he pulled him onto his staff as Special Projects Officer. The order was simple: modify every attack aircraft available. No more high-altitude showpieces. They needed ship killers, and they needed them yesterday. The work was brutal. In hangars at Townsville, Australia, Gunn and a handful of mechanics scavenged weapons from wrecked planes, fabricated mounts from scrap metal, and test-fired every gun themselves. They added cheek blisters with extra machine guns, locked dorsal, turrets forward, and wired firing triggers to the pilot's control. Weight shifted forward, making the plane's nose heavy, but Gunn redistributed equipment and added ballast. 8 guns firing together created recoil that shook the airframe, so he reinforced the nose. Ammunition storage was reconfigured, cooling vents were carved, and every weapon was harmonized to converge at 200 to 400 yards. Gunn himself ran the tests, making minute adjustments until the tracers converged into a single stream of death. It was not just about the machines. Gunn trained crews to fly at treetop level, to hit at maximum speed, to use guns not as defense, but as the spearhead of attack. The concept was radical. These bombers would no longer sneak above the clouds. They would roar just above the waves, guns blazing, terrifying ship crews before releasing bombs that skipped into hulls. The precision of the bombardier was gone. In its place was raw violence married to engineering improvisation. By the end of 1942, enough aircraft had been modified to form entire squadrons. The idea was ready for combat. And in the Southwest Pacific, the sea lanes were full of targets. Japan relied on convoys to move troops, supplies, and reinforcements. Every one of those ships was a chance for Gunn to fight his private war, and perhaps, just perhaps, shorten the nightmare for his family behind barbed wire. The sea around New Guinea in early March of 1943 was deceptively calm. Beneath the surface of its blue waters sailed a convoy that held the fate of thousands of men. 8 Japanese transports carried nearly 7,000 troops of the 51st Division, escorted by 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Masatami Kimura. Their mission was simple but critical. Reinforce lay on the northern coast of New Guinea. If they succeeded, Japanese ground forces would be strengthened and perhaps hold the line against Allied advances. If they failed, those men would never reach the battlefield. Allied intelligence had been watching. Thanks to intercepted Japanese communications, General George Kenney knew almost the exact timing, route, and composition of the convoy. It was the largest reinforcement attempt since Pearl Harbor, and Kenney was determined to annihilate it. This was the test of everything Gunn had built. No doctrine, no manual, no safe distance bombing. This was going to be low-altitude war. On March 2nd, Allied aircraft shadowed the convoy through storms. High-altitude bombing runs by B-17s harassed the ships, forcing evasive maneuvers, but scoring few hits. Japanese sailors may have felt uneasy, but Admiral Kimura still believed the armada could push through. By dawn on March 3rd, the convoy was within sight of Leh. The seas were calmer, the skies clearer, and for a fleeting moment, it looked as though they would arrive intact. Then the horizon darkened with the approach of nearly 90 Allied aircraft. The attack began with a distraction. B-17s dove in from medium altitude, scattering bombs that splashed uselessly around the ships. But the real blow came at sea level. Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters swept in first, their 20mm cannons chewing through decks, silencing anti-aircraft guns. Japanese sailors scrambled, manning weapons, shouting orders, but chaos had only begun. Moments later, the roar of twin Wright R-2600 engines signaled the arrival of the modified B-25s. Flying barely 50 feet above the waves, they approached like predators skimming the surface. At 1,000 yards, the pilots opened fire. 850 caliber machine guns unleashed nearly 200 pounds of lead every second. The air filled with tracers, walking across decks, ripping through gun crews, shredding bridges, smashing superstructures. One transport after another was swept clean of defenders before bombs were even dropped. Then came the skipping bombs. Released at full speed, they bounced once, twice across the waves before slamming into steel hulls. With delayed fuses, they penetrated below the waterline before exploding. The effect was catastrophic. One transport lurched as its keel snapped. Another vanished in a column of spray and smoke, its midsection torn apart. Admiral Kimura's own flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, was struck. Fires raged, explosions ripped through its magazine, and within the hour it sank beneath the waves. The battle lasted barely 40 minutes, but it was carnage. Ships that survived initial strikes were finished off in the afternoon when Allied aircraft returned. The destroyer Asashio was torn apart. The transport Kembu Maru was split in two. By nightfall, every transport lay at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. 4 destroyers joined them. More than 5,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead or drowning, their bodies scattered among burning oil slicks. Of nearly 7,000 troops embarked, only about 1,200 ever reached Leh, many without equipment, exhausted, defeated before they could fight. Allied losses were astonishingly light. 1 B-17, 3 P-38 fighters, 13 airmen killed. For such destruction, it was barely a scratch. The mathematics were brutal and clear. Japan could not sustain these losses. A single battle had proved that land-based aircraft, when properly modified and flown at low altitude, could wipe out a heavily escorted naval convoy. For Gunn, working in Australia as the reports streamed in, the news must have carried grim satisfaction. His outlaw modifications, conceived in grief, hammered together with scavenged parts, had changed the course of a campaign. The Japanese lifeline to New Guinea had been severed. Convoys that once arrived with impunity now faced annihilation. Never again would Japan attempt a major daylight convoy in those waters. The balance had shifted. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a victory. It was proof that Gunn's innovations worked. Proof that Kenney's faith in low-level tactics was justified. Proof that desperate improvisation could achieve what formal doctrine could not. For the Allies on the ground, it meant relief. No more endless waves of fresh enemy troops. For Japan, it was disaster. Their garrisons in New Guinea were now isolated, left to wither and starve. And for history, it was a turning point. The modified B-25 had earned its name, the Strafer. A bomber reborn as a predator, roaring just above the waves, its guns spitting fire, its bombs skipping into steel. A machine that transformed the Pacific War and carried the mark of a father's fury. The smoke had barely cleared over the Bismarck Sea when the reality set in. Japan's ability to reinforce New Guinea by sea had been shattered. What had once seemed like an unstoppable flow of convoys was reduced to wreckage on the ocean floor. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. For the Japanese high command, the lesson was brutal. They had underestimated what modified land-based aircraft could do. From that day forward, large daylight convoys were abandoned. Supplies trickled in by night, carried on barges hugging the coastlines or in the holds of submarines. It was slower, riskier, and never enough to keep isolated garrisons fed. Soldiers stranded in jungles fought bravely, but they were increasingly cut off, forced to survive on dwindling rations. Starvation and disease became as deadly as Allied bullets. For the Allies, the victory proved that innovation and adaptation were as vital as sheer numbers. Skip bombing, once a theoretical exercise, was now battlefield reality. Combined with the Strafer nose that Gunn had engineered, it was a weapon that multiplied effectiveness beyond expectation. What had taken entire formations of aircraft in earlier months could now be accomplished by a handful of modified B-25s. The efficiency was staggering. One squadron could destroy convoys that might have otherwise cost fleets of ships or weeks of ground combat. North American aviation took notice. Engineers visited the workshops in Australia, studied Gunn's makeshift modifications, and began incorporating them into factory models. The B-25G and H variants mounted heavier weapons, including 75mm cannons, while the later B-25J blended the lessons of combat with mass production. Thousands of these bombers rolled off assembly lines, many carrying forward-firing guns in configurations directly descended from Gunn's work. The concept of a gunship, an aircraft designed not to drop bombs from altitude but to shred targets with overwhelming firepower, was born in these desperate months. Decades later, gunships like the AC-47 and AC-130 in Vietnam would trace their lineage back to the improvisations of a grieving father in Australia. But while factories adjusted and doctrines shifted, Gunn's own war remained deeply personal. His family was still imprisoned in Manila. Letters, smuggled through the Red Cross, offered fragments of hope, but the truth was grim. Food was scarce in the internment camp. Disease spread easily. Japanese guards grew harsher as the war turned against them. Every success Gunn engineered in the skies was shadowed by fear for Polly and the children. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had been a triumph, but it did not open the gates of Santo Tomas. Through 1943 and 1944, B-25 Strafers devastated Japanese strongholds at Wewak Rabaul and across the Philippines. Their roar became infamous. Japanese troops called them the bats out of hell because of the way they screamed in at treetop height, unleashing torrents of fire before anyone could react. Hundreds of ships were destroyed. Thousands of aircraft were lost on the ground. The Pacific slowly tilted toward Allied victory, and Pappy Gunn's fingerprints were on every success. In late 1944, Gunn himself was wounded during an airfield attack on Leyte. White phosphorus bombs exploded nearby, tearing into his shoulder and rendering his right arm useless. At 45 years old, his days as a combat pilot were over. Yet his war was not finished. He continued to advise, to innovate, to push for more effective weapons. And in February 1945, his private war found its resolution. Elements of the 1st Cavalry Division stormed Manila and liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp. Polly and the children were among the thousands freed, just hours before Japanese guards could carry out executions of camp leaders. The family was malnourished, scarred by 3 years of captivity, but alive. Weeks later, they were flown to Australia and reunited with Gunn. After years of separation, despair, and uncertainty, the war that had begun with loss finally gave him back what mattered most. The impact of his work did not end with his personal story. In the wider canvas of World War II, the modified B-25 demonstrated how adaptability could change the balance of power. It showed that when standard doctrine failed, innovation from the field could rewrite strategy. The defeat of the Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea was not just a tactical victory. It was a warning to every navy in the world that without air superiority, no fleet could sail safely. Even Japanese officers admitted afterward that the psychological blow was devastating. Convoy commanders no longer trusted the daylight, no longer trusted their escorts, no longer trusted the sea itself. The skies belonged to the Allies, and that meant the outcome of campaigns was already written. Gunn's bombers turned the Pacific into a killing ground for ships, and Japan never recovered its ability to move forces in strength across those waters. After the war, Gunn retired as a colonel, decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and 9 Purple Hearts. He rebuilt Philippine Airlines, continuing to fly until his tragic death in 1957 when a storm brought down his plane. He was laid to rest in Florida, far from the jungles and seas where he had waged his private war. But his legacy endured, not only in museums and air shows where B-25s still thunder across the sky, but in the very doctrine of modern air forces. In the grand history of World War II, his role might seem small compared to generals and presidents. But the truth is different. A single man's defiance of the rulebook helped cut off Japan's supply lines, saved thousands of Allied lives, and shortened the road to victory. It is a reminder that innovation is not always born in laboratories or headquarters. Sometimes it is born in grief, in anger, in the determination of a father who refused to accept defeat. The Pacific War was vast, brutal, and unrelenting. Millions fought, millions died, and countless stories were lost to the tide of history. Yet among the strategies, campaigns, and famous generals, the story of one man stands apart: Paul Pappy Gunn was not a general. He was not a man who sat in Washington drawing plans. He was a father whose family was imprisoned, a mechanic turned officer who refused to accept the limits of regulation. In his hands, grief and determination forged a weapon that changed the rhythm of war. The modified B-25 Mitchells that roared into the Battle of the Bismarck Sea were not factory models. They were the product of sleepless nights in hangars, of scavenged parts, of a refusal to wait for permission. They flew at mast height, their guns blazing, their bombs skipping into the sides of ships. They broke convoys, shattered morale, and shifted the tide. This was not just about firepower. It was about vision, the courage to look at failure and decide it could be different. World War II was a conflict defined not only by mass production and overwhelming numbers, but also by the rare individuals who dared to defy the script. Gunn's modifications did not win the war alone, but they multiplied Allied strength at a moment when it mattered most. In World War II, his creations silenced the guns of Japanese convoys and gave starving garrisons no hope of reinforcement. And today, looking back at World War II, we see more than machines and battles. We see how a father's pain and persistence helped alter history itself. What does this mean for us now? It means the fight for freedom is never just about armies or governments. It is also about individuals who refuse to accept the impossible. It is about those willing to risk everything for justice, independence, and peace. Gunn's story reminds us that even in the darkest hours, innovation can rise from the ground up, from ordinary hands determined to make a difference. The world once inherited ashes and sorrow from wars that scarred generations. But the legacy of men like Gunn points to something else: a reminder that courage, imagination, and sacrifice can shorten nightmares and bring peace closer. The question is what we do with that legacy today. Will we allow silence to rule, or will we raise our voices for peace, for justice, for freedom? If this story has moved you, let it not end here. Share it, speak about it, pass it down, because remembering matters. History has shown the cost of forgetting, and the price is always paid in lives. The modified B-25s may no longer thunder over the seas, but their echoes remain. They speak to us across time, urging us to eliminate fascism, to fight for peace, to fight for national independence, to fight for justice, and above all, to fight for freedom.